We've been on a long road together. We started in a voting booth with the simple, foundational act of making a choice. And we've spent 5 episodes following the money that shapes what choices you are allowed to make. From Midland, Texas, to the Texas Capitol. From a rebranded PAC to a hair salon owner turned state representative. From an East Texas Senate race funded 90% by one man, to a Michigan Senate race funded 98% by another man, from a state that isn't Michigan. We've named names. We've cited sources. We've followed the documented public record, wherever it led. And now I want to ask the question that all of that was building toward. What do we do about it? Not in the abstract, not in the someday when the right people are in charge sense. Right now, with the system as it exists, with the tools that are available, with the civic infrastructure that belongs to all of us, whether we use it or not. Because here's the thing about analysis paralysis, and I talk about it a lot on this channel, and I mean it every time. Understanding a problem without acting on it is just anxiety with footnotes. And that is not what we do here. This is the final episode of Who Bought Your Ballot? And this one is about what comes next. Welcome back to Ethos Trek. I'm Sarah Gray. Previously in this series, over 5 episodes we built a case. In episode 1, we established the consent framework. Democratic legitimacy requires the integrity of the choice presented, not just the act of voting. In episode 2, we followed Tim Dunn's $3 million to Dan Patrick and the Paxton impeachment trial. In episode 3, we watched the Dunn Network survive a white supremacist scandal by rebranding and winning 11 out of 28 targeted races, backing Shelley Luther to a 7-point primary win in House District 62. In episode 4, we saw the playbook spread to East Texas without Dunn directly involved. Rhonda Ward, James Moyer, 90% of one candidate's funding from a single donor, and a pledge supporting a vote on Texas secession. In episode 5, we followed the money out of Texas entirely. $5 million, the Great Lakes Conservative Fund, and a U.S. Senate race in Michigan where Tim Dunn's investment accounted for more than 98% of a super PAC's total fundraising. Today, we close the loop. Before we talk about what to do, I want to spend a moment being honest about where we are, because I think civic education does a disservice when it papers over the difficulty of the problem with easy optimism. The campaign finance system we have examined in this series is not broken. I want to say that clearly because it is important. It is functioning exactly as the law currently allows it to function. The donations we documented are legal. The PACs we documented are legal. The unlimited independent expenditures, the super PAC structure, the absence of donation limits in Texas state races, the ability of a man in Midland to put $5 million into a Michigan Senate race, all of that is legal. All of it is disclosed, at least at the federal level and in states with robust disclosure requirements. The system is not malfunctioning. The system is doing exactly what Citizens United and subsequent rulings made it possible to do. That matters because it means the solution is not simply enforcement. It's not a matter of catching bad actors and holding them accountable under existing law. The problem is structural. It lives in the architecture of the system itself, in the legal framework that treats unlimited political spending as protected speech, in the absence of donation limits at the state level in places like Texas, in the gap between what is technically disclosed and what ordinary voters actually know. Structural problems require structural solutions, and structural solutions are hard. They require legislation. They require court decisions. They require sustained political will across multiple election cycles in a political environment where the people most able to fund campaigns are often the people most invested in keeping the current system intact. I'm not telling you this to discourage you. I'm telling you this because you deserve an honest accounting. The problem is real, it is large, and it will not be solved by one election or one piece of legislation or one podcast series. What it will be solved by, what it has always been solved by in American history when structural problems got fixed, is sustained, informed, organized civic pressure from people who understand what they are pushing against and why. That is where you come in. Let me lay out as clearly and factually as I can what campaign finance reform that actually address the consent problem would need to accomplish. At the federal level, the core structural issue is Citizens United, a legislative solution through something like the DISCLOSE Act. Various versions of the DISCLOSE Act have been introduced repeatedly in Congress over the past decade, would require significantly more transparency from outside spending groups, including disclosure of donors to dark money organizations that currently operate without revealing their funding sources. The DISCLOSE Act would not overturn Citizens United. It would not cap spending. But it would close the gap between what is technically disclosed and what voters can actually see. And that gap, as we have documented throughout this series, is where a significant portion of the consent problem lives. A more fundamental solution would require either a constitutional amendment reversing the core holding of Citizens United, which is an extraordinarily high bar, requiring 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of states, or a future Supreme Court willing to revisit the decision. Neither of those is imminent. Both of those are worth working toward. At the state level, the picture is more varied and in some ways more actionable. Texas is one of a minority of states with no limits whatsoever on campaign donations to candidates for state office. That is a state legislative problem with a state legislative solution. Comprehensive disclosure requirements, donation limits, and restrictions on the kind of forgivable loan instruments we documented in Episode 2 are all within reach of the state legislatures, if those legislatures have the political will to enact them. Building that political will is a long-term civic project. It starts with voters knowing the current system exists and demanding something different. Several states have enacted meaningful campaign finance reform through ballot initiatives, citizen-driven measures that bypass a legislature that may be too invested in the current system to change it. That pathway exists in Texas. It is difficult. It has been tried and failed before. It is worth trying again. I also want to name something that doesn't require legislation at all. Transparency infrastructure. Organizations like Open Secrets, the National Institute on Money and Politics, the Texas Ethics Commission's online database, and Transparency USA have built tools that make the documented public record accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The information we have used throughout this series to document Tim Dunn's donations, PAC networks, and candidate connections, that information is publicly available. It is searchable. It is free. The barrier to accessing it is not legal. It is awareness. Most voters don't know these tools exist. Part of what Ethos Trek does, part of what the companion resources for this series are designed to do, is close that awareness gap. Money does not equal qualified. I want to step back from the policy discussion for a moment and say something that I think is the moral core of this entire series. Money does not make a candidate qualified. Money does not make a candidate suitable for Democratic office. Money does not confer judgment or integrity or the capacity to represent a diverse constituency with competing interests. It confers viability. Those are not the same thing. This matters because there is a story we sometimes tell ourselves about campaign finance. A story that goes, well, if the voters didn't want the candidate the money backed, they could have voted differently. And there's a kernel of truth in that. Voters do sometimes reject well-funded candidates. Money doesn't guarantee outcomes. But that framing puts the entire burden on voters to overcome a system that is structurally tilted against them. It says, yes, one man in Midland can put $5 million into your Senate race, but if you don't like the result, that's on you. It treats an uneven playing field as a neutral one and then judges the players for not performing equally. The voters of House District 62 could have rejected Shelley Luther. Some of them did. But they were making that choice in the context where Luther had over $183,000 in outside support from a rebranded PAC with a history of white supremacist associations, where her opponent had watched the Dunn Network successfully primary multiple colleagues before him, and where the ambient message of years of coordinated spending had already shifted what counted as viable, credible, mainstream Republican position in that district. Consent requires a genuinely free choice. A genuinely free choice requires something closer to a level playing field than what we currently have. That is not a radical argument. That is the basic logic of democratic theory, stated plainly. Money is not speech in the way that you and I use speech. My speech cannot drown out yours. My speech cannot define who is viable and who is not before a single vote is cast. My speech cannot be amplified by a $12 billion oil sale. When we treat unlimited political spending as the equivalent of protected speech, we are not expanding democratic participation. We are weighting it. We are saying that some voices count more than others, not because of the quality of the argument, not because of the breadth of the constituency, but because of the size of the bank account. That is the argument. I believe it, and I believe it is supported by everything we have documented in this series. Here's the part where we move from analysis to action, and I mean this in the spirit that has always animated Ethos Trek. Not performative activism, not hashtag engagement, but concrete, informed, sustainable civic participation. The companion Substack for this series has a full action guide with specific tools, links, and step-by-step instructions for everything I'm about to mention. Go there, use it, share it. First, know the money in your own races. Before you vote in any primary, in any election, at any level, spend 15 minutes on open secrets for federal races or your state's campaign finance disclosure database for state races. Look at who is funding the candidates on your ballot. Look for PAC money. Look for single large donors. Ask yourself, who built this candidate's viability? And what do they want in return? You don't have to have all the answers. You just have to ask the questions. Second, understand the PAC networks. The Dunn Network changed its name once already. It will likely change again. The way to track it is not by PAC name, but by donor. When you see a large outside expenditure in a primary race, look at who is funding the PAC. Then look at what else the donor has funded. Open Secrets and Transparency USA make this traceable. The Texas Ethics Commission's database makes it traceable for Texas state races. The FEC makes it traceable for federal races. Use these tools. Third, talk about this in plain language. The consent argument is not complicated once you have the framework. You don't need legal expertise to explain to someone that one man in Midland, Texas, put $5 million into a Michigan Senate race. You don't need a law degree to explain that a judge received $3 million from a network backing the defendant in a trial he was presiding over. These are facts. They are documented. They are in the public record. And they are the kind of facts that land differently when they come from a neighbor or a family member than when they come from a news article. You are a civic multiplier, or as a combat veteran I listen to says, a force multiplier. Use that. Fourth, support campaign finance reform efforts at the state level. In states with ballot initiative processes, support organizations working to bring campaign finance reform directly to voters. In states without that process, including Texas, support candidates at the legislative level who have made disclosure and donation limits part of their platform. This is a long game. It requires showing up across multiple cycles. That is exactly the kind of sustained civic engagement that has moved structural reform in American history before and can do it again. Fifth, and I want to be direct about this because it's the thing people are most likely to skip. Register. Vote. In the primary, not just the general. The primary is where the consent problem is most acute, because the primary is where viable candidacies get defined. If you are not voting in primaries, you are ceding the most consequential part of the election to the people who show up. And in low turnout primaries, the people who show up are often the most ideologically motivated, the most organized, and the most connected to exactly the kind of donor networks this series has been documenting. Your presence in that primary is not a small thing. It is the thing. We started this series in a voting booth, and I want to end it there too, because I think the voting booth is the right place to hold all of this. Not because voting is sufficient. We have spent 6 episodes documenting in careful detail why voting alone in a system shaped this way is not sufficient to guarantee the consent of the governed, but because voting is where democratic participation begins, and because the people who benefit most from the current system are counting on you to feel like it doesn't matter, to feel like the money is too big and the system is too entrenched and your vote is too small to make a difference. They are wrong. Not naively, not optimistically. They are factually wrong. Movements that change structural systems in this country were built by people who voted and talked and organized and voted again and kept going across cycles when the change didn't come fast enough. They didn't have the advantage of the information infrastructure we have now. They did not have the transparency tools, the campaign finance databases, the ability to follow the money in ways that used to require a team of investigative journalists and years of FOIA requests. You have those tools. This series has tried to show you how to use them. The consent of the governed is not a historical artifact. It is not a phrase that belongs only in the Declaration of Independence or in a civics textbook. It is a living standard, a test that our democracy either passes or fails in every election, in every primary, in every race where money shapes the menu before you ever walk through the door. Tim Dunn did not ask for your consent. James Moyer did not ask for your consent. The network that rebranded after a white supremacist scandal and won 11 out of 28 races did not ask for your consent. But you have it. It has always been yours. And the work of this show and the work of every episode, every Substack, every action guide is to help you use it in ways that are informed, sustained, and equal to the moment we are in. Thank you for sticking with me for this series. Thank you for your attention, your engagement, and your willingness to sit with difficult material and come out the other side ready to act. That is what Ethos Trek is for. I'm Sarah Gray. As usual, the full references and action guide will be in the Substack companion. If you like this content, please poke that thumbs up button. Leave a comment. Consider subscribing. It really helps the algorithm figure out what to do with my content.